In the silent underworld, where true power never announces itself, one man mastered the art of control without a sound. His name was Paul Vario. To the law, he was a specter in the Lucchese crime family. To his crew, he was the unchallenged architect of a hidden empire. He operated as a ghost, until a single night in 1978 tore down the veil, revealing a lifetime of calculated corruption, fierce loyalty, and a sacred code about to be broken from within. This isn't about flashy gangsters. This is the chronicle of a strategist who knew that real authority works in whispers. It observes, plans. It moves when everyone else is asleep. Paul Vario built his criminal dominion on patience, iron discipline, and a vow of silence that would be obliterated by the one thing he never saw coming: betrayal by his own. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? What's the time there? Did you come to learn about this hidden history? To relax? Or perhaps fall asleep to an incredible true story? Let me know in the comments. If you value deep, respectful true crime explorations, please subscribe. And if this opening has you hooked, hit that like button. It helps these forgotten stories find a wider audience. Get comfortable. This is a detailed account, and I promise it's worth your time. This is the complete story of Paul Vario, the silent ruler of Brooklyn. The year was 1914. As Europe plunged into war, in a crowded Brooklyn neighborhood, a child was born who would become one of America's most powerful, yet unknown, crime bosses. Paul Vario arrived on July 10th. This wasn't the Brooklyn of today. It was raw and unforgiving. East New York, where he grew up, was a melting pot of immigrant struggle and ambition. Italian, Irish, and Jewish families lived in cramped quarters, all fighting for a piece of the dream. Paul's parents were part of the great Italian exodus, seeking a new life away from southern Italy's poverty. They came with little but a will to work, taking the toughest jobs. But they faced harsh discrimination and closed doors. In this climate, alternative power structures took root. The community created its own systems for support and enterprise. The origins of the American Mafia are found here, in the collision of old world ways and new world hardships. Young Paul watched this play out on the streets. He saw men who commanded respect without official titles. He saw families protected by neighborhood figures, not the police. He learned that real power was unofficial. The neighborhood was his classroom. Street corners were markets. Social clubs were centers where deals were made and disputes settled. The economy was brutal. The 1920s veered from recession to a brief boom, then into the Great Depression. For immigrant families, financial instability was a constant. Men scrambled for any work. In this reality, young men like Paul faced a stark choice: a life of grinding, low-wage legitimate labor with no future, or a step into the shadow economy where ambition could actually pay. For Paul, the path was clear. The streets became his education. By his teens, he was running with local crews, learning the trades: loan sharking, numbers, theft. These weren't random crimes. They were businesses. What set Paul apart was his temperament. He wasn't flashy or loud. He was a calculator. He understood leverage. He knew when to be generous and when to be merciless. These qualities would define his career. The community lived by codes from the old country. Respect for elders was absolute. Family loyalty was everything. And there was omerta, the code of silence. To talk to the law was the ultimate sin, punishable by death. These were the rules of survival. Paul internalized them completely. Even under immense pressure, he would never break omerta. This was his identity. By the late 1920s, Paul was getting noticed by the established men. They saw a blend of intelligence, loyalty, and cold pragmatism that marked him as a future leader. The period from the late 1920s through the 1940s transformed America and Paul. Prohibition, the Great Depression, World War II, events that reshaped the nation. Organized crime adapted and grew. Prohibition was a massive gift to organized crime. By banning alcohol, the government created a huge black market. The syndicates filled the void. Paul came of age near its end. While too young for the major bootlegging wars, he learned from those who were. He saw how profits were made supplying illegal services. He saw how violence protected markets. He saw the need for political corruption. When prohibition ended, the syndicates pivoted to gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and narcotics. This diversification defined them for decades. Paul began his serious apprenticeship. He worked with Brooklyn crews, learning from the bottom. The work was unglamorous, collecting debts, running numbers. But Paul was patient. He knew you earned your place. The New York underworld was formalizing. After the Castellamarese War, a new structure emerged. Charles "Lucky" Luciano organized the factions into the Commission with the 5 families. Paul would rise to captain in the Lucchese family, known for its discipline and focus on labor racketeering. This low-profile approach suited him. By the late 1930s, Paul was embedded in the Lucchese organization. He ran his own crew, conducted operations, and, crucially, earned. In the mob, your value is your earning power. Paul was a reliable earner, and that bought him protection and advancement. World War II brought new chances. With men drafted, labor shortages created black markets. The mob controlled these, profiting from ration goods. Their influence in shipping through unions offered avenues for cargo theft. Paul navigated this era well. He stayed out of the service and built his operations. By war's end, he was a respected, rising member. The post-war period was a golden age for American organized crime. The booming economy created fresh opportunities for corruption. For Paul, it was a time of immense potential. He became a capo, a captain in the Lucchese family, commanding his crew in Brownsville, East New York. This was middle management, below the boss but above soldiers. A capo ran operations, earned money, and sent a cut-up. In return, he kept a share and had the family's backing. His territory was ideal, a working-class area ripe for rackets, but crucially, near Idlewild Airport, later JFK. This proximity became his greatest asset. His operations were diversified. His crew ran numbers games. They engaged in loan sharking. They infiltrated unions, skimming funds, and extorting businesses. One lucrative venture was truck hijacking. Highways carried goods from ports and airports. Paul's crew would identify valuable loads, cigarettes, liquor, electronics, and hijack the trucks, sometimes with inside help. The stolen goods were fenced for profit. But most importantly, Paul cultivated connections at Idlewild Airport. Opened in 1948, it became one of the world's busiest. Billions in cargo moved through it: jewelry, cash, furs. It was an irresistible target. Paul knew robbing it required inside information. He built relationships with workers, cargo handlers, security, airline staff. Some were on his payroll. Others owed him debts. With these insiders, Paul's crew pulled off numerous heists. They got tips, struck during transfers with precision. These were surgical operations, not violent robberies. Paul's management style set him apart. He wasn't flashy. He lived in a modest home, maintained a working man's appearance. This was deliberate. Invisibility was a weapon. He was disciplined and demanded it from his crew. Show up, do your job, don't take stupid risks, follow the rules and you prosper. Break them and face consequences. Yet he could be generous. If you earned well, you were paid well. If arrested, your family was cared for. This mix bred intense loyalty. His relationship with Lucchese leadership was solid. Gaetano "Tommy" Lucchese, boss until 1967, was also quiet and disciplined. They were a good match. Paul paid his tributes, avoided messy violence, ran a tight ship. In return, he had the family's backing. During this period, Paul was formally made. The ceremony involved an oath of loyalty, drawing blood, burning a saint's image, swearing to put the family above all. This was a sacred bond. By the late 1950s, Paul Vario was a major figure. He earned substantial money, managed a capable crew, and had respect. But the coming decades would bring greater heights and his ultimate ruin. Every empire needs a capital. For Paul, his was the Euclid Avenue taxi stand in Brownsville. From the outside, utterly ordinary. A small storefront with a few cabs. But to those who knew, It was the nerve center of a multimillion-dollar empire. It was Paul's throne room. The genius was its perfect cover. Why do men gather? They're cabbies. Constant traffic? It's a busy business. Inside, the atmosphere was old world. Coffee, food, card games. Conversation in Italian and English. But beneath the surface was a strict hierarchy. When Paul was present, he was in charge. Men came for approvals to report earnings. Paul held court, listening, deciding with a nod. Daily operations were run from here. Money came in from loan sharking, gambling, hijackings. Paul took his cut, sent tribute up, distributed the rest. Records were verbal. Payments were cash. This made prosecution hard. Paul's authority was absolute but quiet. He didn't shout. Those who challenged him faced consequences. But he was seen as fair. If loyal and productive, he helped you. This paternalistic approach was traditional. The taxi stand also served a social purpose. It was a gathering place where bonds were reinforced. These ties held the organization together under pressure. Paul's personal life was separate. He was a family man. He tried to keep home life distinct. His wife knew, but some things weren't discussed. Law enforcement pressure was constant. The FBI knew about the taxi stand. They conducted surveillance, tried to plant bugs. Paul and his crew adapted, watching what they said. The stand was raided, but rarely led to major convictions. It was a cost of business. Despite pressure, the taxi stand remained his headquarters. It was a symbol of his power, humble, unassuming, effective. A boss needs a strong crew, and Paul built one of the most formidable. These were specialists. The most crucial was James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke. Despite the nickname, Burke was a ruthless, brilliant heist planner. He was smart, charismatic, and remorseless. Burke specialized in hijackings, especially at JFK. He had a network of inside sources. He could plan and execute with precision. His nickname came from a surface charm. The relationship was complex. Jimmy was Irish, so he could never be made. He was an associate. But in practice, he was so valuable and feared, he operated almost as an equal. Paul provided protection and backing. In return, Jimmy kicked up a share. Then there was Henry Hill. Born in 1943, Hill grew up in the neighborhood. As a boy, he idolized the mobsters and attached himself to Paul's crew as a teen. He was eager, smart, good at cultivating relationships with workers for inside jobs. But Hill was not fully Italian, so he could never be made. He would always be an associate, dependent on Paul. This limitation would fester. The third key member was Thomas "Two-Gun Tommy" DeSimone, a psychopath. DeSimone was younger but made up for it with violence and unpredictability. He was a killer who seemed to enjoy it. In the mob, violence is a tool. DeSimone didn't always follow this. His murder of Billy Batts, a Maid Gambino member, over an insult was a major violation. Paul and Jimmy helped cover it up, but it created tension. DeSimone's violence was useful when directed, but his lack of control made him a liability. Beyond these, the crew included drivers, strongmen, inside men, fences. The organization was efficient. Their operations were varied. Truck hijackings were common. Airport heists were more complex but lucrative. Using inside info, they'd identify valuable shipments, jewelry, cash, strike, and vanish. A significant early score was a 1967 Air France cargo heist, a rehearsal for something bigger. Beyond heists, they ran gambling, loan sharking, union corruption. The crew's dynamics had strict rules. Loyalty was paramount. No cooperation with police. You followed orders. You earned and kicked up. Violence enforced the rules. For minor infractions, a beating. For major ones, death. Despite the brutality, there was camaraderie. These men spent immense time together. Paul presided with unchallenged authority. He made big decisions but listened to his top men, especially Burke. This crew would peak with the Lufthansa heist in 1978. But that event would trigger paranoia, murder, and betrayal that destroyed them all. If the taxi stand was his throne room, JFK Airport was his treasury. It was the source of his greatest wealth and his downfall. To understand why, grasp the scale. By the 60s and 70s, JFK was one of the world's busiest. Hundreds of flights carried everything from ordinary freight to immense valuables. Jewelry, cash, electronics. The total value was staggering. Security was lax. Cargo areas were poorly guarded. Employee checks were minimal. For criminals with intelligence and inside help, it was an open vault. Paul understood this. His proximity, skill, and insiders made him the top airport thief in New York. But he didn't operate alone. Several crews had interests requiring balance. The key was inside information. You needed to know when shipments arrived, where they were stored. This required people on the inside: cargo handlers, security, airline employees. Paul invested in these sources. Some were on payroll. Others were compromised through debts. Others were greedy. Union control was crucial. The mob had infiltrated airport unions. By controlling leadership, they could place their people and protect them. The Lucchese family had influence with the Teamsters, giving them an advantage. The thefts varied. Sometimes subtle: cargo lost and ended up with Paul's crew, insurance covering the loss. Other times brazen: a truck hijacked, a warehouse burglarized with inside help. The airport provided a constant income. While scores varied, the cumulative total was immense. Paul earned hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, annually from the airport alone. His relationship with Burke was key. Jimmy had talent for heists and a vast network. Paul provided protection and mob backing. Prime targets were cash shipments, untraceable, easy to spend. With good info, even protected shipments were vulnerable. Jewelry was another target: small, portable, valuable. Electronics were also popular, easy to sell. Despite profits, risks were real. The FBI knew the airport was being looted. They investigated, surveilled, tried to flip insiders. Some associates were arrested. The mob's response was careful. They watched conversations, used businesses to launder money, had lawyers, used intimidation. For 2 decades, Paul and his crew exploited JFK, generating wealth while avoiding major consequences. They never killed the goose. But this balance would shatter. In December 1978, Burke convinced Paul to approve one more job, bigger than anything. That decision would destroy Paul's world. To understand Paul, understand the man. Paradox: enormous power, low profile. Absolute loyalty, quiet voice. Capable of violence, yet mundane. These were strategic. Physically unassuming. Average height, balding, blended in. Dressed simply. Ordinary cars. Comfortable, not showy home. Everything said, "I'm nobody." Deliberate. Flash attracts attention. Invisibility let him operate. Personality matched. Reserved. Taciturn. Listened more than spoke. Words were measured. Quiet exterior hid a ruthless core. He didn't hesitate to order violence for disloyalty. That he didn't shout made him more frightening. Worldview was old-school Italian: honor, respect. Loyalty to family was everything. A man's word was binding. Omerta was absolute. To cooperate was the ultimate betrayal. Paul internalized this. Leadership was paternalistic. A father figure responsible for welfare, demanding obedience. If loyal and productive, he helped you. If disloyal, you faced wrath. This created bonds, but also resentment. Relationship with Lucchese leadership was professional. He ran his crew, earned, paid tributes, avoided trouble. As a capo, he was middle management. He ordered violence, bore responsibility for numerous acts. Despite this, he was respected. He played by the rules, wasn't reckless, a man of honor. Personal life was conventional. Married with children, tried to keep family separate. Enjoyed simple pleasures, food, cards, camaraderie. As he aged, health declined: heart, respiratory, diabetes. Paul was conservative. He represented the old guard, at odds with younger, reckless mobsters like Hill, who were impulsive and into drugs. Something Paul discouraged. Paul was a product of his time: Depression-era Brooklyn, Italian culture, the mid-century mob. His strengths let him rise and hold power for decades. His weaknesses: inability to adapt, control the new generation would contribute to his fall. But in his prime, he was one of New York's most successful criminals. He built something substantial, profitably, quietly. That invisibility ended on December 11th, 1978. December 11th, 1978 began like any night at JFK. In the Lufthansa cargo building, employees worked. None knew they were about to make history. Around 3 a.m., a van arrived. Masked, armed men entered. They knew where to go. This was meticulous planning based on inside information. The robbers subdued workers, binding them. No extended violence. They were pros. They knew security schedules. Inside was approximately $5 million in cash and nearly $1 million in jewelry. The cash was untraceable, returning from Germany. The total take was nearly $6 million, over $25 million today. They worked efficiently, loading the van. The whole operation took under an hour. By the time security knew, the crew was gone. They left terrified workers and the largest cash robbery in American history to that point. The mastermind was Jimmy Burke. But he needed inside help from Louis Werner, a Lufthansa worker deep in debt to mob bookies. Werner saw the heist as his escape. He told Martin Krugman, a wig salesman involved with Burke and Hill. Krugman told Hill, who told Burke. Burke saw potential and planned. He recruited a crew: Tommy DeSimone, Joe Buddha Manry, Pernell Stax Edwards. Others. Each had a role. The plan was meticulous. They studied layout, guards, the perfect time. Paul Vario's role was insulated. He didn't participate in the robbery or planning. But Burke wouldn't do such a major job without Paul's approval. As capo, Paul authorized significant activities in his territory. He certainly benefited. Evidence suggests Burke presented the opportunity, Paul gave blessing, and expected his share. The immediate aftermath seemed a triumph. They had the biggest cash robbery in American history. The crew divided proceeds, Burke taking the largest share, Paul getting his cut as capo. Everyone had huge cash, but the triumph soured fast. The Lufthansa heist was too big, too notorious. It was national news. The FBI launched a massive investigation. The pressure was unprecedented. This broke a cardinal rule: don't attract attention. Paul always preferred steady, low-profile scores. This was the opposite, a huge score putting everyone under a microscope. Worse, the crew didn't lay low. Some spent conspicuously new cars, jewelry. For experienced criminals, this was amateur. Jimmy Burke knew the danger. Law enforcement would look for sudden wealth. Participants might talk. His solution was brutal: eliminate everyone who could testify. A bloodbath followed. Martin Krugman, who complained about his share, vanished in January 1979. Body never found. Joe Buddha Manry was found shot dead in his car in May 1979. Louis Werner was arrested in February 1979. Convicted. Burke wanted him dead, but he was in custody. Pernell Stax Edwards, who failed to dispose of the van, was found shot dead weeks after the robbery. Tommy DeSimone disappeared in January 1979. The story was he was being made. The truth was he was killed for the Billy Bats murder. The Gambino family demanded revenge, and Lucchese leadership allowed it. Killings continued. Paolo Pauly Castri, Angelo Sepe, others were murdered. The death toll is uncertain, estimates from 6 to 10 or more. Burke was wiping out witnesses. Paul watched with alarm. The cleanup was necessary criminally, but each murder brought more law enforcement attention. The Lufthansa heist, a crowning achievement, had become a catastrophe. The FBI investigation was relentless. They interviewed hundreds, followed leads, pressured witnesses. They knew who was involved but needed proof. Then they got their break. Henry Hill, Paul's protege, was about to become an informant. By 1979, Paul's world was unraveling. Lufthansa fallout brought scrutiny. Bodies piled up, and Henry Hill was falling apart. Hill was deep in cocaine dealing, breaking mob rules and destroying his judgment. Paul had warned him, but Hill didn't listen. He was using and dealing heavily. The money was huge, but risks were too. On April 27, 1980, Hill was arrested on narcotics charges. Evidence was substantial. He was facing life in prison. In jail, Hill had a choice. Stay silent, uphold omerta, go to prison, hope Paul cared for his family. Or cooperate with the feds. Tell everything about Paul, Burke, the Lucchese family, decades of crime. This would keep him out of prison, put him in witness protection, but make him a rat, marked for death. The FBI pressed hard. Hill was terrified. He'd seen Burke's cleanup. If Burke suspected he might flip, he'd be killed. Hill's wife, Karen, pushed him to cooperate. She was tired of the life, the danger. She wanted out. In June 1980, after negotiations, Henry Hill decided he would cooperate. Debriefing began immediately. For hours, days, weeks, he met with FBI and prosecutors. He described Paul's organization, structure, operations, crimes. He explained airport thefts, naming insiders. He detailed Lufthansa, planning, participants, money. He described murders, Billy Bats, the cleanup. He gave them Burke, DeSimone, dozens of others. Most devastating for Paul, Hill outlined decades of his crime: loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, airport thefts, hijackings. He explained Paul's role, methods, relationships. He provided dates, names, amounts. Everything Paul built over 40 years was laid bare. Hill's cooperation was catastrophic. In the mob, information is compartmentalized as defense. But Hill had been with Paul for over 20 years. He knew players, methods, history, and he would testify. Paul learned of the betrayal through the grapevine. Reaction was disbelief, then cold fury. Hill had been like a son, but nothing could be done. Hill was in custody, then witness protection, unreachable. Only option was to prepare for indictments. They came fast. Based on Hill's testimony and FBI evidence, prosecutors built cases against Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, many others. Charges included racketeering, extortion, murder conspiracy, fraud, spanning decades. Paul's legal troubles weren't just federal. In 1980, he was convicted on state charges for concealing restaurant ownership for a liquor license. He got a 4-year sentence, his first significant incarceration. At 66, facing life in prison, declining health, it was devastating. His organization was assaulted. His protege had betrayed him. Everything was collapsing. Jimmy Burke was also arrested, eventually convicted, sentenced to life. He died in prison in 1996, never cooperating. Lucchese leadership faced its own problems. Multiple members indicted. Law enforcement pressure intense. The era of impunity was ending. RICO statutes, better investigations, more informants changed the game. For Paul, in prison, watching his world crumble, it must have seemed everything he believed was a lie. The honor, loyalty code, Hill shattered it. The organization couldn't protect him. But even then, Paul Vario never cooperated. He never broke. He never testified. Whatever bitterness, he held to the code. Perhaps pride. Perhaps fear for family. Perhaps it was who he was. Henry Hill's cooperation was messy. From fear, desperation, self-preservation. His relationship with Paul was fracturing before arrest. Cocaine use heavy, dealing open. He was drawing heat. Paul tried to rein him in, but Hill, addicted, didn't listen. When arrested, initial instinct was silence. But facing decades, resolve cracked. FBI appealed to self-interest, prison versus protection, freedom. They said they knew much. His cooperation filled blanks. Hill could tell himself he wasn't betraying new info. Karen Hill was crucial, pushing him to cooperate to save their family. Debriefing was exhaustive. Hill was an exceptional witness, great memory, insider knowledge. He had evidence, photos, records. Crimes were numerous. Air France heists, Boston College point shaving, loan sharking, union corruption. Most dramatic, Lufthansa and subsequent murders. While not direct participant in most killings, he knew and could link Burke. He gave detailed testimony on Billy Bat's murder, which he witnessed and covered up. He explained mob union control, naming corrupt officials. He provided a full picture of Paul Vario's empire. For Paul, learning the betrayal details was agonizing. Not a random informant. Someone he'd mentored, protected, treated like family. The personal cut deep. In mob culture, this was ultimate cowardice. A price was on Hill's head, but he was protected, untouchable. Legal process moved. Indictments came. Prosecutors prepared. Paul's lawyers attacked Hill's credibility. Criminal, drug addict, rat saving himself. But prosecutors had corroboration. Other witnesses, documents, surveillance. Hill's testimony wasn't alone. As Paul sat in prison on his earlier conviction, awaiting more trials, he reflected. He built his empire carefully, avoiding risks, following old rules. But the world changed. The new generation didn't respect old ways. RICO laws made prosecuting organizations easier. And omerta was breaking. More mobsters cooperated. Paul represented the old guard, men who believed in loyalty and silence. That world was dying, and he was dying with it. Henry Hill represented something new, pragmatic self-preservation. From Hill's view, he'd given his life to the mob, and when he needed help, it couldn't save him. His cooperation was survival, not betrayal. Both perspectives held truth. Paul mentored Hill, but protection was conditional. When Hill became a liability, protection vanished. The relationship was transactional. The 1980s were a reckoning for organized crime, Paul at the center. His first significant conviction was 1980 for restaurant fraud. At 66, first extended incarceration. For a man who wielded power, it was psychologically and physically hard. Health was declining, prison worsened it. But this was start. Based on Hill's testimony, federal prosecutors built RICO cases. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was the government's top weapon. Instead of proving individual crimes, they could show a pattern through an organization. Penalties were severe, up to 20 years per count plus asset forfeiture. Paul faced multiple RICO indictments early 80s. Charges included extortion, loan sharking, fraud, conspiracy. Each was thousands of investigation hours, multiple witnesses, Hill as star. Trials were major events. Prosecutors presented evidence, surveillance photos, wiretaps, financial records, witnesses. Henry Hill's testimony was central. He was on the stand for days, describing his mob life, crimes, Paul Vario's role as leader and beneficiary. Hill was compelling, articulate, great memory for details. But defense attacked his credibility, criminal, drug addict, rat with incentive to lie. Paul's strategy was to attack Hill while staying silent. His lawyers argued Hill was a liar, testimony untrustworthy. But prosecutors had corroborating witnesses and documents. They showed Hill's account was part of a larger evidence body. Atmosphere was tense. Prosecutors determined to bring down mob figures. Defense fighting for clients facing decades. Paul's family, associates, journalists watching. Paul was stoic, dressed appropriately, respectful, no emotion. But inside, agony. Hearing his former protege detail crimes, his life's work called criminal enterprise, facing life in prison. Verdicts were devastating. Paul was convicted on multiple counts across trials. Judges were unsympathetic. He lived a life of crime, caused harm, corrupted institutions. In one significant case, he got 10 years for extortion. With his earlier sentence, he was facing effective life. At his age and health, he wouldn't survive it. Impact went beyond Paul. This was part of a wave against New York families. Bosses, underbosses, capos were convicted unprecedentedly. Families were dismantled. RICO, better investigations, interagency cooperation, omerta breakdown were factors. The Lucchese family was hit hard. His power was greatly reduced. For Paul personally, trials and convictions marked the end. His freedom, power, respect, financial security gone. His organization scattered, key members dead or imprisoned. His family's reputation tarnished. At 72, Paul Vario entered federal prison to serve his sentences. The quiet dawn of Brooklyn was an elderly inmate, power gone. Federal prison is harsh for anyone, but for an elderly man with declining health, brutal. Paul was likely in a medium security facility. Routine is rigid, scheduled meals, work, lights out. Loss of autonomy was devastating. Guards gave orders. Inmates obeyed. This reversal was a profound humiliation. Prison eliminated the hierarchy and respect. He was just another inmate. Mobsters in prison keep some status and organization. They look out for each other. Paul connected with other Lucchese members. These relationships gave some continuity and protection. But Paul's age and health made it hard. He was in his 70s with multiple ailments, respiratory illness, heart problems, diabetes. Prison medical care is often inadequate. Delays, limited access to specialists, bureaucracy. His conditions worsened. Daily routine was monotonous. Wake up, breakfast, work or recreation, lunch, more activity, dinner, lights out. Days blended. For a man who lived an eventful life, boredom was torture. Visits from family were breaks. His wife and children visited when possible, though logistics were difficult. These visits were emotional. Letters were another connection, but they were censored. Prison officials read all mail. Truly private communication was impossible. Paul learned through visitors and letters about the continuing deterioration of his organization and the mob world. More arrests, more convictions, more cooperation. The empire he built was being destroyed. Jimmy Burke was imprisoned, would die behind bars. Henry Hill, the rat, was in witness protection, alive and free, while those who stayed loyal suffered. This knowledge filled Paul with bitterness. He lived by the code, maintained omerta, even when cooperation might have reduced his sentence. And what did it get him? Prison and destruction. Meanwhile, the traitor was protected by the government that imprisoned him. But even in prison, Paul kept his dignity and silence. He never cooperated. He never testified against anyone. He never sought to reduce his sentence by betrayal. This consistency, this adherence to principle, even in the worst circumstances, earned him respect in the mob community. He was a man of his word, loyal to the end, whatever the cost. As months and years passed, Paul's health declined more. Respiratory problems got worse. Breathing became difficult. Heart issues worsened. Diabetes needed careful management that prison made hard. Paul was an old man, deteriorating in an environment with limited medical support and no comfort. By 1988, it was clear Paul didn't have much time. His body was failing. Prison medical could only offer palliative care. Paul was dying slowly, uncomfortably, in a federal prison, surrounded by guards and inmates, not family. His final days were marked by the same institutional routine that defined his incarceration. There is profound sadness in this ending for a man who had such power. Paul Vario commanded respect, controlled an empire, influenced events. He lived a rich, if criminal, life full of excitement, danger, achievement. And it ended with him as an elderly, sick prisoner dying in an institution, his power gone. What did Paul think in those final days? Regrets about his chosen life? The people he hurt? The violence he ordered? His family, the legitimate life he might have had? Or did he remain convinced he lived honorably by his code? That the problem was Hill's betrayal and society's failure to understand mob traditions? We can't know. Paul never wrote a memoir or gave interviews. He kept his silence to the end. But we can imagine a man in his position, facing death in prison, had complex emotions. Pride mixed with bitterness, satisfaction at living by his code mixed with anger at how it ended. On May 3, 1988, Paul Vario died in a federal prison in Fort Worth, Texas. He was 73. Official cause was respiratory illness, though his multiple health problems all contributed. His body gave out after years of decline and poor medical care. The death of a mob boss, even an imprisoned one, usually gets attention. But Paul's death was quiet. Obituaries in New York papers noted his Lucchese connection and Lufthansa, but no major coverage. He lived quietly and died quietly. Paul's body was returned to New York for burial. The funeral was modest. No elaborate mob funeral with hundreds of mourners and flowers. By 1988, such displays were rare. Law enforcement documented mob funerals to identify associates. Prudent mobsters kept them small and private. Family attended, his wife, children, close relatives. Some old associates not in prison or on the run may have paid respects, but no grand gathering. The era for that was over. Paul was buried in a New York cemetery. A simple headstone, no elaborate monument, no dramatic inscription. Just a name, dates, perhaps a brief epitaph. In death, as in life, Paul was relatively invisible. A man whose huge impact on the underworld left few visible traces. Reaction in the mob community was mixed. Those who stayed loyal remembered a respected capo who lived by the code and died without breaking omerta. A man of honor by mob standards, who kept his dignity and silence in the worst circumstances. His death removed one of the last old guard, a generation that built the modern American mob. Younger mobsters, those who didn't know Paul or were considering cooperation, might have seen him differently. A relic of a dying era. A man whose adherence to outdated principles led to his destruction. In the pragmatic survival calculus becoming common, Paul's choices looked foolish, not honorable. Law enforcement who pursued Paul for years likely felt satisfaction at his death in prison. They didn't get him for everything, but they broke his organization, ended his career, ensured he died imprisoned. By law enforcement standards, a significant victory. Henry Hill, living under witness protection, learned of Paul's death through handlers or news. His reaction is unrecorded, but complex. Hill had betrayed Paul, provided testimony that contributed to his imprisonment and death. There might have been guilt, satisfaction, or indifference. Hill himself struggled for years in protection, with substance abuse and the psychological challenges of a false identity, cut off from everything he knew. Paul Vario's legacy is complicated. On one hand, a successful criminal who built a profitable enterprise for decades, skilled at his chosen profession, commanded loyalty and respect in his community, lived by a code many in his world admired. On the other hand, a criminal who caused real harm. His loan sharking drove people into debt. His thefts cost businesses. His connection to murders meant people died. The corruption he spread weakened institutions. From one perspective, Paul was a product of his time. Italian immigrants faced discrimination and limited opportunities. Organized crime offered a path to prosperity and respect that legitimate society denied. Paul chose that path, excelled, paid the price when society caught up. From another, Paul made choices. He chose crime over legitimate work. He chose to hurt others for his benefit. He chose to continue even with enough wealth. He chose to maintain an organization on violence and corruption. These were his decisions, and he bears responsibility. Undeniably, Paul Vario was significant in organized crime. He ran a major crew in a powerful family. He was involved in notorious crimes. His operations generated millions and influenced countless lives. He mattered in his world. But in broader American history, he is a footnote. Remembered primarily for Lufthansa and because Hill's testimony was immortalized in film. Without these, he might be forgotten. Just another criminal who briefly had power, then lost it all. His story is a reminder of the rise and fall that defines the criminal underworld, and the personal costs of a life built on silence, loyalty, and ultimate betrayal. If you made it all the way to the end of this deep dive, you're a real one. Leave a comment with a crown emoji so I know you were here for the whole journey. If you appreciate these detailed, well-researched stories from the criminal underworld, please subscribe to Winds of Thought. And if this video provided value, give it a like. It really helps. Thank you for watching.